today that I rarely do. And I do it today because of several circumstances. One of those circumstances is the fact that 3 weeks ago, you may not be aware of this, but 3 weeks ago was Right to Life Sunday. And all over the country, they have what is known as the Life Chain. And what this is a group of people of like mind, not necessarily believers. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but one of the most famous atheists that in history, Christopher Hitchens, was pro-life. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. From the position of atheism. Very significant. And what happens is someone, in the case of Waycross, Deborah Giddens, will organize. She'll drive up to a location, in this case, Jerry J's over there on Plant Avenue, and she will bring a trunk load of signs, and everybody who wishes to participate is given a sign, and they stand next to the roadway with that sign and make it visible to all those who pass by for an hour. It's from 2 to 3. They do it all over the country. And so on that 1 hour, which then turns into 4 hours, obviously, as the time frames change east to west, you have people, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people standing on the side of the road with a sign that says something regarding abortion and the fact that it shouldn't be. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take a topic. I don't like to do this because I don't think necessarily that a sermon is the place for this, but I felt compelled to do it today just because we never have. And so I'm going to speak to the issue of abortion, but I'm going to speak to it in a way that perhaps you aren't ready to. Maybe you'll think this is a waste of your time. Maybe you'll think that some of the things that I might say don't have anything to do with the Bible. And in some ways you may be right about that, but I'm going to speak to it in a way. Let me just get into it. How about that? I'll start out with Ronald Reagan's quote. And I love this quote. I actually changed it a bit because I felt like his quote lacked some of the impact I wanted it to have because it was so intelligent. I thought I need to make this as powerful as possible. He said this. He said, "Abortion is advocated only by those who weren't."
Oh my goodness.
Now, he said it in a much longer fashion, but I condensed it down because I thought, wow, does that not get to the kernel of the logic of this? Abortion is advocated only by those who weren't. They're here to advocate for it. But you and I as Christians, now this is where it becomes gnarly. We as Christians we become very emotional about this issue. If you've ever watched television, which I presume everybody in this room has at some point in their life, you have seen a pro-life, pro-choice debate of some kind, whether it's the talking heads on Backfire or Crossfire or whatever that show is, where they sit across from one another and you can't hear anything that's going on because everybody's talking at once. They don't accomplish very much, but there's a lot of heat and very little light. And our problem as Christians, I have been to the seminars that our denomination puts on. Been to a couple of them. They bring in a senator. They bring in somebody of great import to the cause of pro-life. And they speak. And inevitably, what happens is they show a poster, they show a picture, and under it they've got a Bible verse punctuating that picture. Now, I'm not here to say I believe this is God's written word to humanity. So don't mishear me. I'm not saying it's not powerful. But let me warn you. In this debate, in this culture, the culture is biblically deaf. And to quote a Bible verse to somebody on behalf of this issue, sorry, it carries no weight whatsoever. None. So how can we speak to this issue from a biblical worldview, not using the Bible as a tool, but using the tools that were given that everybody accepts, reason and science? How can we do that? I think we can. And so we're going to learn a little bit about that today. There are lots of resources out there. After the service, if some of you want those resources, I'll be glad to provide you with those websites. You can go there and get those resources for yourselves. I'm going to read one text. It's Genesis chapter 1. And I do this for a very specific reason. In verse 27 of chapter 1, the Torah, which is the first 5 books, the teaching, that's what the word Torah means, says this. So God created, and the word there that says in all of your Bibles, man, is not man. It's Adam. God created Adam. That's the word that the Hebrew uses just for humanity, for human. God created Adam in his own image. In the image of God, they were created, male and female. That one text establishes the biblical understanding of what, and I'll use a 50-cent word, the intrinsic worth of the human being. Intrinsic means it's part of our nature. You can't extract it without making us something other than human. And our worth is that we are the only image bearers in creation. Now, this makes the human individually worth more than all other living things, period. And the way that the West has structured its ethic from the time of Jesus until this day is based upon that text. The text that tells us that our worth is above all other living things, period. We're going to get to that in just a moment. This little text represents the sum and the total of the theology about human worth. Now, I know there are lots of others, and there are lots of inferences we can make from the cross and everything else that would say we are worth a lot. And I agree with all of that, but this is the text that our framers even used. If you and I go somewhere to argue something like this, and we get into a crowd and we start to talk about human worth only has that infinite worth if it's something that is in us, not something conferred to us. And the framers got that from here. If this isn't true, then all of our rights are alienable, every one of them. Now, we as believers, we tend to quote biblical proofs, and I've been to those meetings, and that's what they do. And everybody in the room is a Christian, and everybody in the room is amening, and yes, sir, and you preach it and all that, and that feels really good, and everybody goes out and says, boy, we've stuck it to abortion issues today, haven't we? We've learned a lot, and we're ready for the world. And then life goes on. The reason is, again, the world is deaf to the Bible, period. They are. Most people in our culture do not see the Bible as authoritative. That's hard to hear, isn't it? But that's the truth. That is the truth. So our arguments must be scientific and philosophical. From science and reason, if we do that, we do it from the standpoint of the text I just read. That's the biblical worldview. And if we argue the Bible, we're going to have to defend it. You can stand there and quote those texts, and somebody who doesn't believe it will say, okay, well, why should I believe that? Now you're in a different position, aren't you? You've now got to defend the Bible. You're no longer talking about abortion. You're talking about defending this as God's Word, and that's a big job. There are fat books written just to make that case. So we will lose that ground entirely. If we argue the biblical worldview not using the Bible, we then make the Bible relevant. That we have to do. So let's do this today. I hope this is helpful to you all. If it's not, if you know all this and you doze off on me, that's fine. I understand. Don't worry about it. But these arguments are the 8 arguments that the abortion crowd says are the reasons why abortion should be free and legal and always available at any part of the woman's pregnancy. So let's look at those. And I want you to realize, too, I think it's important for we who say we are followers of Jesus to realize this. Those who argue for legal abortion practiced at any point in the woman's pregnancy are doing so for the same reason that we argue against it. These aren't people with horns and pitchforks that are just evil. There may be some, but most of them are arguing these positions because they truly care about human life. They do. We argue from the same stand. We need to remember that. We need to remember that. Okay, let's take the 8 most I can't find any more arguments. If there are any, let me know. These are the only 8 that I can find within the literature. 8 arguments from the standpoint of why an abortion should be legal and should be able to, a woman should be able to have it at any point in the pregnancy. The first one, and they make a lot of sense until you unpack them. No legal access to abortion will kill women. Now, prior to Roe v. Wade in 1972, you may not recognize this name, Bernard Nathanson.
Yeah.
Bernard Nathanson said he personally performed 60,000 abortions. Bernard Nathanson became a Christian. Bernard Nathanson then produced the film The Silent Scream, which is an ultrasound rendering of an abortion as it takes place. Very difficult to watch. Bernard Nathanson said of these numbers, 5,000 to 17,000 women dying every year prior to Roe v. Wade from illegal abortions, because all abortions were illegal. He said the statistic is a total lie, totally fabricated, but it was useful to us. That's why we promoted it. In 1972, these are not my statistics, these are the government statistics, the government numbers. How many women died from illegal abortions? They were all illegal, so that makes it universal. How many women died? 39 in 1972. Now, that's 39 too many. If you're one of them, or the husband or the child of one of those women who did die, that's a terrible thing. But it's not 5,000 to 17,000. And by the way, the imagery that's always set forth is some guy with a plaid jacket and sunglasses in some dark room exchanging money and taking dirty instruments and performing an abortion on a woman because she can't get one legally. That is utterly a lie. 90% of all the abortions performed when they were illegal were done by doctors. They were done by doctors. Second argument, no access to legal abortion will place unwanted children in the world. Remember that in the 80s? Every child a wanted child. Doesn't that feel good? I like saying that. I mean, it sounds really good. Couple of problems. The fact that a child's not wanted, does that justify taking their life in the womb? Is that a remedy that should be justified? I don't see how. And secondly, what are we talking about when we talk about a wanted child versus a non-wanted one? Do we really want to locate a child's worth in whether or not they're wanted by an adult? Does that even make sense? How many women have been exploited that way? The man suddenly came to a place where he just didn't want them any longer. Wanting somebody is not a measurement of worth. Third argument. If we don't have the access to it, only the rich will be able to afford it. Well, should the vices of the wealthy become virtues for the poor? I mean, think about it this way. You got two forms of cocaine in our country that are in use. One is cocaine, the other is crack. Crack is cheap, and crack is very potent. Well, hey, then we'll just provide crack. Because it's cheaper. So the vice of the wealthy becomes the virtue for the poor. I mean, it makes no sense. Cocaine's too expensive. Let's dispense crack. Argument number 4. No access will cause the population to explode. Now, this one is just, for me at least, about as close to utter illogic. It's almost like the child stomping their feet when they want a piece of candy before the meal. It comes across as saying, look, okay, so we're going to have too many babies. Well, then let's just terminate the pregnancies. That'll solve the problem, won't it? Is that a justifiable way to solve a population problem? It makes no sense. Why don't we just take all the 12-year-olds out and shoot them? Yeah. I mean, that's just as good. That'll get rid of a lot of the population, right? Let's take the numbers of abortions and take that many people out every year and shoot them. Does that make sense? 4,000 a day. We take 4,000 people, herd them into a stadium, and shoot them every day. And by the way, read any good book on economics, and what will you find? That any country whose population grows, so does their economy. So the population problem, did you know? This is another statistic of which you may not be aware. You could take the entire world population and place it in Texas, and there'd be plenty of room for everybody. Isn't that unfathomable that the world is that vast? Oh, 7 billion people, what are we going to do? The entire population could live in Texas and there'd be enough room for everybody. No access will remove gender equality. Now this one is another one of these, what's known in philosophy as a non sequitur. It doesn't follow logically. How is it that a surgical procedure makes someone more equal? How does that work? And think about it this way. Would not a better remedy, instead of taking the life that's in the womb, would not a better remedy be we make men and women responsible for their actions? Wouldn't that be better? Number 6, no access will increase birth defective children. Now, look, let's just do a simple working logic here. All right, if we have more births because we eliminate abortion, there'll be more babies, right? And if there are more babies, then statistically, that percentage that are born defective will be a greater number, right? That's true. But is that a reason to take a life? You may know who Stephen Hawking is, the guy in the wheelchair who speaks through the speech synthesizer, who's been sitting in the Lucasian chair at Cambridge University, the same chair of physics that Isaac Newton sat in. Well, what if his parents had had access to the genetic information we have today, and they had seen that he was going to develop Lou Gehrig's disease? They might have decided to abort him. And we wouldn't have had Stephen Hawking, the greatest living physicist on this earth. How many Stephen Hawkings have we lost to the tune of 4,000 a day? Heaven only knows. That's not a reason to take a life in the womb. No access, number 7, will leave female rape victims helpless to have the fruits of the rape. Now this is a tough one because there is some truth here. There is. And I would never want to say to a woman who'd been raped, you must have this child. But the numbers don't bear this out. Because of all the rapes that take place, only 2% result in a pregnancy. That's a very small number. I know it's a big number if you're the woman, so I have to be very careful here, but that's not a reason to make abortion free and legal at any point in a pregnancy, is it? There are other ways to handle that. Other ways. Number 8, no access increases children born into poverty. Well, that's another one of those weird kind of logic things. Of course it does. There are just more children, period. So obviously, statistically, there'll be greater numbers born into poverty. But in the West, in this culture and in the Western cultures, it begs a question, does it not? What is poverty? In our culture, poverty is you've got an 18-inch flat screen instead of a 48. I'm not trying to be funny. That is poverty. How many in this room have ever known the poverty that says, over the next month, I don't even know if I'm going to have food? That's poverty. But we don't know anything about that here. So it's hardly a real reason, is it not? And by the way, in all of these 8 arguments, we've just taken each one and questioned the logic, and that's all we're doing. In all of these 8 arguments, they all beg one question for sure. And this is really important to keep in mind in this debate. The question they all beg, do you know what begging the question is? That means that you're saying something, but you're leaving something else assumed. What is the assumption here in all of these arguments? That a fetus isn't a person. That's the question that's begged. What is a fetus? Now, according to Marianne Warren and Peter Singer, 2 very prominent philosophers who right now speak and write in this realm very effectively, by the way, they are saying that the debate about whether or not a fetus is a human being, that debate is utterly settled. That is not a debate. All of the embryology textbooks that you can find on the planet will tell you that once you have the zygote, once you have the fertilized ovum, you now have a genetically independent organism, period. All of the genetic information that makes you, and me, is contained right then and there. So the human life begins at conception, period. It's not even medically debatable. Nobody debates it. Now they debate what is a person. That's where the debate is located. And it's a very philosophically precise way of quantifying what a person is. The problem is you've now rendered personhood into a quantity. We're no longer an entity. That's a big problem right from the get-go. But how do they do it? 5 ways. They have 5 criteria that have to be met. You have to meet at least 3 of these pretty well in order to even qualify as a person. What are they? Consciousness. You have to be aware of objects and your place in space that you are. You have to be aware of that. Number 2, reasoning capacity. If I were to fill this room up with rocks and you're here and you have to get to the exit, you have to be able to figure out a way around the rocks. You have to be able to solve problems in your life in order to say that you're a person. Number 3, you have to be self-motivated. That is, everybody's heart will genetically be pre-programmed pretty much to beat on its own. Your lungs will expand and contract on their own. But if we're going to be a person, we have to be able to move our bodies in an actionable way ourselves. That's the 3rd criteria. The 4th one, capacity to communicate. Somehow, whether it be writing on a pad, waving your arms, sign language, or speaking as I am now, we have to be able to transfer our thoughts to another mind. And 5th, self-awareness. I have to know something like race and gender and individuation, that I'm not you and you're not me. Now, these 5 criteria are what establish in these philosophers' minds personhood. What's the problem here? The problem is they confuse 2 categories. One is they confuse the category of function with the category of being. Think about it. Marianne Warren says this: until 18 months old, a baby is not a person. Because they don't meet the criteria. And she says, and Peter Singer, and Richard Dawkins, in a document that she and Peter Singer wrote, have said until 18 months old, a parent should have the right to do away with that life until they're 18 months old, because it's not a person. Because they don't meet the consciousness criteria. There are a lot of problems with this. I mean, besides the obvious ones, the philosophical problems are huge. What do you do with somebody who's in a coma? Right? We try to keep them alive. Why do we do that? Why do we try to keep a person who's in a coma alive?
With the expectation that they might.
Right. And so what aspect of living does the work of keeping them alive? The future. What aspect of the work of the life in the womb makes that life worth being born into the world? The future. Same thing. Same thing. Is there a bottom line here? Yes, there is. And I want us to take time. There's a word, it's an acronym. And again, you can find all this on the internet and read to your heart's content. But I want to present this today just for those of you who haven't encountered this kind of material before. All of the arguments beg the question, what is the fetus? Embryology makes it very clear that an embryo, once fertilized, is a distinct genetic organism. And personhood cannot be applied, because if you do, there's no fixed scale. They say in the literature, Peter Singer and Marianne Warren say this: if you meet 3 of them pretty well and 2 of them not so well, you're a person. But if you only meet 2 of them fairly well and 3 of them you don't meet, you're not a person. They're trying to establish what a person is. So let me ask you the question then today. Let's ask ourselves this question. What difference is there between us now and us when we were an embryo that tells us we have more of a right to life now than we did then? Can you think of anything? Here's the acronym. It's called SLED. You may have heard this before. SLED. It's an acronym that stands for 4 distinct places in which these differences can be seen to not make a difference. The first one is size, the S. A zygote is 1/10 of a millimeter. If you put a dot at the end of a sentence, it's about half that size. Okay, all of the genetic information is there for that person who is in the future going to be. So if size is a problem, then I guess all of the offensive linemen in football have far more right to live than you and I. Because they're really big, right? Size can't be a criteria by which we judge personhood. Level of development. That's the L in SLED. A 2-year-old girl is not as developed as a 26-year-old girl. The 2-year-old can't have children. Lots of other bodily systems are not yet developed. So should the 2-year-old be less a person than the 26-year-old? Think about what that says. Should that disparity be a way in which we make a criterion for human worth? Environment. That's the E in SLED. You and I, before we were born, we lived in our mother's wombs. Okay, how is it that that little short trip from there to here, it's a very short distance, how does that short distance change our status as far as whether or not we're persons? How does it do it? I'm just asking the question. How does it change our status? Number 4, dependency. The D in SLED. Okay, if obviously when we're in the womb, we're completely dependent. I mean, the umbilical cord provides all the nutrients, all the blood flow, all the oxygen, everything, the food, everything that causes us to develop, which, by the way, we do on our own. Nobody from the outside cobbles people together. God has engineered it such that we're set up to self-develop. It's an amazing thing. But we are dependent. Well, if dependency is a means by which we judge whether or not a person is a person, what about somebody who's a diabetic? Are they not insulin dependent? What about a person in a wheelchair? What about a person on oxygen? What about a person just in terms of age spread? Where do we make that line that says because you are this dependent, you don't have the right to live? We don't do that. So what is it about us that makes us equal? That's the question, is it not? What is it about you and me and everybody and the life in the womb that makes us equal? During the 7 debates that Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas had, you can go read them on the web, it's very interesting reading. The argument from Stephen Douglas concerning the slave was that slavery should, one of the arguments and the one that was hammered the most was that the slave should be allowed to be owned because we as the government the government has no right to take away somebody's property. What's the problem with that idea? What is the black person? What are blacks? Are they not people? Or are they just merely property that can be owned? It's the same problem with the life in the womb. Is the life in the womb a person or is it not? You know, in our country we say all are created equal. We're given these inalienable rights via our creation, by our Creator. All of those rights become completely alienable unless we share that common humanity. That's what makes us equal, the common humanity that we share. And the zygote is every bit as human as we are. I want to close with this. And by the way, isn't it do you think that it would be good? Who would we want to hand the power to determine who is a human person and who is not? Do we find some blue ribbon committee in Congress to decide that? How do we do that? I want to close with this one statement, which I hope you will find helpful. It's been helpful to me. I wish I had made it up. I mean, it's so good that I wish I had thought of it. Greg Kokel, another one of these internet folks that you can find a lot of information about. He says this, I've quoted it many times to a lot of people. He says, if the fetus isn't a person, then no argument to justify abortion is necessary. He's right. If the fetus isn't a person, we can kill it because it's not a person. It has no value beyond that of a frog or a mouse or an insect. But then he says, if the fetus is a person, no argument is acceptable. And he's right. I don't know where you all are in your lives as believers today. One thing I can say for sure is with this issue, we can get angry, we can get heated, we can do all of that, we can wring our hands. But there are ways in which we can aid those who want to aid those who are pregnant when they don't want to be. And you can find those places all over. People that are willing to give of themselves such that the pregnant woman who is debating this in her own life has the means to say, you know what, I'm going to have this child, I'm not going to take this life. Those are available to us. But I hope that today you can see it's not a biblical argument. It's an argument wherein reason and science play a huge role, and we need to learn to use those tools, I believe. I don't know where everybody is. If I've said anything that you find disturbing, or you don't agree with me, or you want to pray with me, you want to talk to me about joining this church, whatever you want to